everyone, and welcome back to AV Geeks at the Hunt Library, not at the Hunt Library. I'm Jason Evans Groth. I'm the Digital Media Librarian at North Carolina State University Libraries for the Learning Spaces and Services Department. And welcome back. Thank you for hanging out with us over the last several weeks while we move this to a virtual world where we can be in cool rooms with cooler stuff. Well, maybe not cooler than what we see in the Hunt Library, but certainly more characteristic of our individual needs rather than a 10 projector room that you can't possibly have at home. If you do have one at home, let us know. We'll do next semester's work at your house. So this is our 11th semester of the series. We partner NCSU folks with Raleigh's AV Geeks, specifically Skip Elsheimer, to discuss vintage educational and classroom films. Skip, whose name you'll hear all night, is the head of AV Geeks, founder of AV Geeks, an NC State alum. He's been for the last several decades collecting films made throughout the last century, mostly on 16 millimeter, mostly educational training and other sorts of how-to movies. He's awesome. He does a great job sharing them and providing access to them and to the world. He houses over 27,000 of these objects and films at the AV Geeks archive right here in Raleigh, and shares them as stock footage for films and exhibits, research material, and during public events like this. And tonight's theme is travel, and we're very excited to welcome our guest, Dr. Tammy Gordon. Dr. Gordon is Director of Public History and a Professor of History at NC State University. Her new book is called The Mass Production of Memory, Travel and Personal Archiving in the Age of the Kodak, and it'll be out in November. And this is Dr. Gordon's second appearance with us at AV Geeks at the Hunt Library, so welcome back. While a quick PSA, while there are over 200 of AV Geeks compilation videos available for checkout while the NC State University libraries are open, we are not open right now, but instead you can visit avgeeks.com or search for AV Geeks in YouTube or go to archive.org and watch some movies, thousands of them there. This is the last show of the summer. So again, thanks for adapting to this model and for tuning in. We've had a great time, and we'll be back when school starts up again in August. But let's not wish it away. Instead, Skip, why don't you take it from here? And thank you.
Thanks, Jason. And Tammy, do you want to say something just so people can see your face?
Hello. Nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. So the way we've been doing this is a hodgepodge of various types of meeting technologies, and so I'm doing something crazy tonight that might blow up in our face, not literally, but virtually. So when I heard that Tammy was going to be our guest, our host, or our expert, I was like, she's doing something about tourism, she's doing something about photography, and so I kind of started looking for tourism films, which we have several, and I know of some online, but I was like, wait a minute, home movies. Home movies have so much about that document vacationing, that documenting travel. Why don't we show some home movies? And I help do a home movie day every year. Actually, I do several in a year. I've already done 2 so far. And so what a better way to talk about people vacationing and doing road trips than to actually show them from different times in our lives. And this first film is it's a mentor of mine, Rick Prelinger, who has a vast archive himself, but he also compiled a great film called No More Road Trips, which basically shows people going on road trips, circa 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And what we're going to do is watch it, and then we're going to, since it's silent, we can talk about it, Tammy and I. And then if you have questions or if things you want to point out or ask either Tammy or myself, then please write it in the comments on Facebook or YouTube, and we will come around to those questions. So are we ready to travel? Are we? Anybody? All right.
Always ready to
All right, here we go. So I'm going to do some crazy Zoom stuff here first, and then we're going to make this all work. It's absolutely insane. So this is No More Road Trips, and Rick shows this film silent and encourages people to comment out loud But since most of you can't comment out loud, would love to read your comments and what you have to talk about. So let me do a little bit more magic here. Wabam, wabam. All right, here we go. No more road trips. And so this is Rick collects home movies that he finds at yard sales. He finds at thrift stores, on eBay, at film labs that have gone defunct. And so he transferred these films and then compiled this this footage.
I like this this clip of this family because he's focused on reading his Red Ryder comic book while the mom lectures about history, and I believe this is Lexington Concord, a famous historic site, and in the post-war period. Many families got on the road and looked at historic sites. There was a new imperative in that period, given the building tensions of the Cold War, to go to historic sites as like a patriotic duty. And then this little guy gets a new camera. It's so cute. So picture taking and tourism had been connected since the first Kodak in 1888 by the Eastman Kodak Company. It was one of their main marketing tools, was to promote the Kodak as a travel camera. They promoted it as a tool that modern people would use, along with the car and the train, to have family experiences and to see the world around them.
So somebody asked a question, is Dad holding the camera? And in your experiences, Tammy, who held the camera? Who took the pictures?
That is a great question. Thank you so much for that. Oftentimes, according to the Kodak marketing, it was supposed to be women who were the culture keepers, and women were often pictured with the cameras in their advertising. In the post-war period with the moving film, it was often usually the dad who was interested in that. And though that technology was considered perhaps too sophisticated for women to handle, but in the earlier period, the Kodak promoted its still cameras with the tagline, "You press the button and we do the rest." Right, so it was presented as something that was not technologically sophisticated, unlike the moving camera, which was more sophisticated.
Interesting.
Has something happened with our clip? I'm getting just a little slice of it.
I'm not quite sure. Oh, actually, I think I know what's going on. Never mind. Hold on. This is that technology problem that I was talking about earlier.
Sure.
Do you see it?
It's back. It's
okay.
Fine. Yeah. And one of the things you see a lot in vacation snaps as well as videos is travel infrastructure, right? So you get a lot of pictures out plane windows, you get a lot of videos of moving down the road, and you also get a lot of evidence of roadside America. So the restaurants, the service stations, all of those roadside attractions, right? They grew up as the interstate highway system grew, especially after 1956, with the Federal Highway Act of 1956, which was also called the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act, because it was funded thinking that people could get out of cities quickly if there was a nuclear attack. So that's a part of the Cold War history that facilitated domestic mobility in the post-war period.
So this is footage we're watching of Times Square, which has always been, this visually stunning light show.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody's asking the question, when did color film become prevalent? And I mean, I know technically when it came prevalent, but when do you feel the consumer started adopting that and thinking it was important?
In still pictures or?
Well, because either way, either one.
Yeah, that's a great question. Probably, and please, Skip, correct me on this if I'm wrong. Probably mass consumer adoption of color film was probably around the 1950s, even though the Cine Kodak was out around 1919. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, there were all these different types of color schemes that Kodak was trying. Like they had Kodacolor, which was this odd thing with, you had different lenses and red, green, and blue. But it's when they were able to make this system that was actually inexpensive and easy to shoot, and that was, I feel like, definitely in the 50s for still photography. I would say it starts showing up in the 40s. Is motion picture photography.
Mm-hmm.
It was more expensive, obviously, but
right. These were these things that were usually adopted by a wealthier class. But there's the George Eastman House of Photography, which you can visit. You can still visit that today. And I took a selfie of with the daguerreotype of Louis Daguerre. So there's a layer of photographic geekery that can happen at the Eastman House today.
And that's in Rochester, New York.
Yes. And here you can see a lot of the roadside America that I was talking about. There's an Esso station, right? So a lot of that was built up around the new roads. So a lot of states started investing in roads supported by automobile associations in the 1920s. But that roadside stuff that you see was really building up by the 40s and 50s. Here we see a visit to the Capitol. And this is a little later from the 70s. And I wanted to talk, you can see two African-American children in front of the Lincoln statue. So African-Americans had a difficult time traveling in the United States because of segregation, and they had to draw on resources like the Green Book, which was started by Victor Green in 1936 to help African-American travelers find services because of segregation. So after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which forbade discrimination, even though it was still a practice, a lot of the travel industry started targeting African-American consumers. So that's a part of our travel history that's really important to consider when we're looking at videos and when we're looking at photographs, because not everybody had the same access to public space to be comfortable filming themselves and their families. And so that's affected the archive that we have about travel. And you can see the interstate system there in the background, the famous clover leaf, right, kind of design.
There's a toll booth.
Mm-hmm. And the classic Howard Johnsons, yep. It was, chains like this also became more common as more people were moving around. Things like Howard Johnson's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, McDonald's started to appeal to consumers because they knew what to expect. But I think these gentlemen ate more than McDonald's. I think they had a few before this. I think there was some more going on.
What's interesting, Tammy, is I transfer a lot of home movies for people, and it seems like there's these giant road trips where they span almost they go from their home all the way to an edge of the country. Like they go from where they live in Virginia all the way up to Niagara Falls, and they hit the similar places on the way. So they go to historic Williamsburg, they go to D.C., they go to maybe Gettysburg, they go, to New York, go to Philadelphia, then they make their way up to Niagara Falls, and then eventually go across to Canada briefly.
Mm-hmm. And that style of travel has pretty deep roots in the United States. In the late 18th and early 19th century, people believed that if you had too much leisure, right, it would sort of undermine the morality of the citizenry, and so people had to be convinced to take leisure. Right, and so one of the things when leisure travel became more available because of the trains and the track system, they started to frame their tourism as sort of like work. Right, you're very busy. You're going from place to place. Oh, it's a child with a cigarette. That's just awful.
I've seen worse in home movies. So.
So that sort of go to see as many places as you can, right, in a short amount of time, appealed to Americans' sense of themselves as a busy people, right?
Right. I mean, and it's actually made fun of in National Lampoon's Vacation.
Yes.
Dad wanting to take the kids across the country to see all these different things, and to see family en route to something that they could just fly to. It seems like it falls out of favor, definitely by the 80s.
Mm-hmm. It became a cultural trope, the family vacation. Since the 19th century, when there was more emphasis on childhood, right, and consumerism, and travel really allowed people to express themselves culturally, themselves in terms of those cultural values.
Right.
When you take your family on the road, right? One historian has called Susan Sessions Rowe has called it the 1950s, the golden age of the family vacation. But it's after that people started to see that it wasn't always fun to go from place to place and be cooped up in a car with your family. So, which is where we get the Chevy Chase movies. You can see people visiting a lot of different places that you wouldn't expect. People used to, in the 19th century, people used to visit institutions, cemeteries, schools. They would even go to workplaces, right, and go down in a mine. So you see places that were a little bit different than what you would think of as a tourist attraction now. We might go to a decommissioned mine, right, or a decommissioned school or institution, but we don't tend to just hop in there where the action is today. They've got an interesting presidential shrine going on their camping site.
And what's interesting is there's this amazing footage of Henry Ford doing a road trip very early on. Like he would bring motion picture film and he would shoot the road trip that he took, and how he would meet up with different artists and different writers and different people of industry as he camped and made his way across the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
So this road trip thing is, and documenting it in film has been happening since there's been cars and since there's been film.
Absolutely. And it goes back to the 19th century travel narrative. It was a more popular book than novel, or the type of writing, right? It was more popular than novels in the 19th century. So these things were very popular. And then people would also even earlier there was Pompeo Batoni in Italy who made himself famous. He lived from 1708 to 1787, and he made himself famous by painting portraits of travelers who came to Italy, usually from England, for their continental tour. So self-documentation predates film by a very long time, and these gentlemen have been hunting for mushrooms. I hope they have a good field guide. But auto camping was something that more working class and lower middle class travelers picked up in the by the 1920s and 1930s. It was a cheaper way to go about and have a tourist experience without having to pay the expense of hotels.
Mm-hmm.
Oh boy. He just turned into a young man. That's adorable. Oh, he's getting younger. Oh, that's delightful.
All right. Okay, so we're back. I asked you, were there particular sites that you were interested in us showing that might you can talk about? And I found you had mentioned basically historic Williamsburg, and then the other one was Greenfield. What was the second one?
Yeah, Colonial Williamsburg and Greenfield Village,
right
outside of Detroit.
All right. I could not find the Village one. There were some mentions of it, and I know that I have it in a industrial film, but it's not home movies. And I'm sure that there's home movies of it out there. In fact, I remember visiting it as a kid, like when my mom took us to Detroit for some reason. I remember going to the Village, but I couldn't find that. But historic Williamsburg, man, you can't swing a stick without finding historic Williamsburg. So I tried to find one that was one of the earliest ones I could find, and this one is part of a compilation reel that was made in the 30s and 40s. And unfortunately, there's not a demarcation of when this took place, but this is their visit. They made their way down from Midwest, and they were making their way through Virginia. So let's watch some of this. This is a Ketchum family road trip. And let me share this. And there we go. And let me change it over here. All right, here we go. Actually, wait a minute. This is not the one I wanted to show. Hold on a sec. Sorry. Sorry, everybody. Let's try that again. That's the full one.
We got to briefly visit Power.
Yeah, Power Incorporated. Unincorporated. Let me find... All right, where is it? All right, I see what I did. Okay. I love you guys aren't seeing all of this, but it's hilarious how many tabs I have open on this computer right now. Okay. Here we go. This is it. All right. So they're starting in Kentucky, and I guess they found some Kentucky whiskey, and they're making their way across the Appalachians. I think that's some tobacco.
Now we're in Colonial Williamsburg here. So this was, remind me again, Skip, what was the year of this film?
I want to say this was in the 40s. It was part of a compilation reel, so it was like late 30s, early 40s.
Okay. Yeah, so Colonial Williamsburg was I guess a preservation project that was started in the 1920s, actually, and they decided they would take down all buildings that predated 1790 and redo them for visitors. And this was funded by John D. Rockefeller. And it was, and the preservation was coordinated by a bunch of different sort of genealogy-based groups, like the Colonial Dames. United Daughters of Confederacy is another genealogical group interested in history and preservation. And you can see these living history, we would call them living history folks today, who would dress up in the clothing of the time. And sometimes they would talk as if they, didn't know of the present, right? And so which created some awkwardness. But Colonial Williamsburg is considered an open-air museum. And it was supposed to instruct people on the country's founding, but also inspire them with patriotism.
All right. So we're back. So briefly, Colonial Williamsburg's in trouble. Is that correct? Nowadays?
I don't know. I can't speak to that.
Okay.
What have you heard?
Well, that nobody wants to go to it anymore. that the novelty of seeing how people lived in the 16, 1700s is no longer interesting to kids
Right.
or their parents.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're kind of struggling.
Right. It's true. Well, it's a major operation. It's I'm not sure how many visitors that they have, but it's also a major preservation job, right? Because all of these houses were redone in the 20s and 30s. So now the recreations are themselves a product of the 1920s, and it's really in 30s, and it's hard to keep that stuff going, right? And now we're just kind of over the artifice, right? That you really can travel in time. It also, in the 1990s, was was one of the first to experiment with getting visitors to talk about slavery, the system of slavery and enslaved people. And it's famous for having a living history reenactment of a slave auction, right? Which you can imagine would be problematic on many levels. And so sites like this that were built around nostalgia for a past that didn't exist, they tended to, visitors now are going to react differently than they did in the 1950s.
Right.
So not that the interpretation has not changed. Colonial Williamsburg is constantly trying to innovate and provide something that the visitors will want to see, and at the same time be true to the history. But it's very difficult to do. You can't time travel, right?
Right.
The people there, the people who are visiting are never going to be a part of that time. David Lowenthal, who wrote a book by this name, said the past is a foreign country, right? So you just, no matter what, you're not going to get everything about the past. And so this is one of the reasons why living history is difficult to pull off, right, for contemporary visitors.
Interesting. So this next film that we have has narration to it. And let me set it up a little bit. basically this film, when somebody actually is mentioning Disney in the comments, yep. This is called Disneyland Dream. This was made by a filmmaker named Robbins Barstow, and he was an amateur filmmaker. He didn't really do this professionally, and he had been shooting home movies and little amateur films since he was a teenager. And so his family won a trip, thanks to Scotch tape, to the opening of Disneyland. And so he documents it. And this is a really fascinating look. It's beautifully shot. It's in Kodachrome, so the color is stunning. And what he did is he shot the film and then he edited it. Then he would put on these shows in his backyard where scores of people would show up. And so the idea was that, and then he would narrate as they watched the film, and he had this kind of patter down. And this is something, I don't know if you ran across this, Tammy, the itinerant filmmaker who would tour around and lecture and show movies that they had shot in different countries. Mm-hmm. That was a popular thing that was in the 20s, 30s, 40s, is that, you know, somebody would go on a safari, they would shoot all this footage, they would edit it together, and then they would tour the country and go to, you know, civic groups and universities and give these tours and make, you know, a pretty good amount of money. So this is what he did on an amateur level, but it captures this amazing part of when Disneyland opened, and you know what it was like to visit LA at that time, and what it was like to travel at that time, and the fact he talks about in this narration, he talks about how they had to scrimp and save to do this. You know, they won the trip, but they didn't win, you know, everything to they could take all their kids. So that's part of this, what I think is fascinating about this. And this film was entered into the National Film Registry as this amazing document of, you know, the time and the place and what it was like to visit Disneyland and to, you know, travel at that time. So we want to watch some early Disneyland?
Yes, we do.
I should say that in posting this online, somebody watched it and found themselves in it as one of the employees. It was someone who looked and said, yeah, I used to work there when I was a kid, and he has like a striped, like peppermint striped suit, and I think he's selling programs or something, and it was Steve Martin. So Steve Martin found himself in this film, and this is why I think home movies are so interesting, because they capture not only the family, but they capture what was happening and what was going on at the time. And so here's Disneyland Dream. Like I said, it has narration, so we'll talk more about this at the end. So enjoy. Let me get to the right tab, though. All right, enjoy.
The three Barstow children of Wethersfield, Connecticut, Mary on the left, Daniel in the center, and David on the right, shared with their parents, Robbins and Meg Barstow, a great enthusiasm for the kind of family fun generated in the 1950s by Walt Disney's early television programs, which they loved to watch together in the living room. When they saw outside the Main Street drugstore in Old Wethersfield a contest announcement of 25 free family trips to Disneyland, sponsored by Scotch brand cellophane tape, they realized that here was a way they could make an impossible dream come true. So they bought not just one, but 6 rolls of Scotch tape, and the whole family set to work. David made a 3-dimensional model of Disneyland Castle using Scotch tape. Mary created a Scotch word puzzle. Young Daniel copied his own words right on the official entry form. And Meg was inspired to write a poem about Scotch tape. I used alphabet soup letters to spell out an acronym. Finally, we carefully wrapped each of these attention-getting entries, plus a photo of all 5 of us using Scotch tape, in a large carton, and mailed it by special delivery to the contest sponsors in St. Paul, Minnesota. We knew we had to make our entries really stand out if we were going to have any chance of winning in this nationwide contest, reportedly entered by over 1 million people. Then came the long wait and a return to ordinary activities like mowing the lawn, with the help of other neighborhood residents, and mowing the boys' hair in the front yard to help keep family expenses down. It really didn't hurt. At that time, we had a little pet parakeet named Binky, and we all kept trying to teach it to say, "Where's the Scotch tape? Where's the Scotch tape?" Then one day in June, Binky seemed to sense something special in the air, and sure enough, a telegram was being delivered to our house. This looked important, so the whole family gathered outside the front door for me to open the envelope. It was from the president of the Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company, and it read, "Congratulations on being one of the winners in the Scotch Brand Disneyland contest." Unbelievably, our dream was really going to come true. Meg was the next member of the family to read the telegram. It said that a company representative would get in touch with us the next week to make arrangements. Then it was 11-year-old Mary's turn to be overcome. A way to start a summer vacation. When 8-year-old David got to look at it, he also was grounded. The telegram actually was addressed to 4-year-old Danny, the youngest, who wasn't really able to read it, but who nevertheless went head over heels at the news. Talk about being blacked out and seeing stars. It was as if there were a whole sky full of fireworks exploding on the 4th of July. It didn't take us long to recover, however. We were one of 25 families across the United States who had won this fabulous prize for a free week-long trip to California, and we wanted to be the first family to get there. So the kids lined up with their Mickey Mouse Club hats, shirts with their names on them, and airline travel bags. Actually, we had to wait till the 3M's representative personally delivered to Danny our airplane tickets and $300 in cash for meals and incidentals. Danny's winning entry was the simplest of all. I like Scotch brand cellophane tape because when some things tear, then I can just use it. The date set for our departure was Wednesday, July 11th. Both the Hartford Courant and the Hartford Times carried photo stories about us, which our friends and neighbors excitedly shared with us. The headlines read, "Danny, 4, labors long, wins vacation for family," and 10 words written by 4-year-old, wins family trip to Disneyland. Meg had previously made for each member of the family a brightly colored Davy Crockett jacket, which we used on camping trips. We thought it'd be great to wear these jackets for our trip, and the whole neighborhood came out to wish us bon voyage. They threw confetti and streamers at us as we got into the car to drive to the airport. We weren't just married, but we were just contest-tied. Back in 1956, there were lots of families with kids, like the Neidles here, living in Stillwell Drive. The Dibbles lived next door on Coleman Road. Neil and June Cox lived in Weathersfield then, and their older daughter Anna was Mary's best friend. Dudley and Ruth Birmingham, with their sons Dick and Alan, lived across our backyard. Mrs. Johnson and a friend represented the older generation in the neighborhood, and the family of Dorothy and Joe Bonin lived right next door to us. What a great send-off they all gave us as we headed up to Bradley Field, as it was 40 years ago. We were going to fly first from Hartford to New York and then to California. We brought along our Scotch tape-made sign, and the pilot and stewardess were greatly interested in our being Disneyland contest winners. The children each wore white sailor hats that had Connecticut written on them so people would know where we were from. This was the first time they had flown in an airplane, so it was very exciting for them. In those days, they didn't have jet planes, just propeller-driven airships. But just being in an airplane like this was a tremendous experience for all of us. The pilot flew right over Wethersfield, so we could look out the window and try to pick out our own house, someplace in the middle down there. When we got to New York, the plane landed at the old Idlewild International Airport, which later became the J.F. Kennedy Airport. We had to change planes here, and I must tell you that the Scotch Tape Contest prize was actually only for a family of 4, and here we were a family of 5 without any extra funds. But since we certainly couldn't leave anyone behind, we worked out a deal. The company had furnished us with 4 first-class tickets, and we simply exchanged them for 5 tourist tickets at no extra cost. It meant we wouldn't get fancy meals served to us in the luxury rear section of the plane, but we were happy just to eat our picnic box lunches in the more crowded forward part of this giant TWA Super Constellation plane, which had a capacity of 64 passengers. Here we are out on the runway, ready to depart for the long 9-hour flight from New York to California. This was a difficult shot to take of the plane taking off, but I used a telephoto lens. As the plane flew over New York City, we could look out the window and see down on the right the United Nations building, and then over on the left the Empire State Building. What a thrill it was to be 4 miles up in the sky, flying high above the clouds. We followed our route on a map of the United States, so we could tell when we flew over the Mississippi River down there below, on our way to a midpoint stop at the striking new St. Louis, Missouri airport. Here they changed crews, and the plane was refueled. As we flew on across the country, above the Great Plains and then the Rocky and Sierra Mountains, we counted a total of 14 states we had flown over by the time we landed in California. We had traveled over 3,000 miles in a single day. This was the first time that any of us had set foot in California. So this was a big moment. We were met at the airport by a limousine which drove us to the fabulous Huntington Sheraton Hotel, where we were booked to spend the next 7 nights. We had never stayed in a luxury hotel like this before, so we didn't quite know what to expect. It turned out that we were the very first of the Disneyland contest families to arrive. When we disembarked from the car in our Davy Crockett jackets, the hotel manager himself was there to welcome us with a great big basket of fresh California fruit. The Huntington Sheraton Hotel has a tremendous expanse of rooms, lawns, trees, and gardens. Its vine-covered architecture is a reminder of bygone days of more leisurely and gentle upper-class style and elegance. The feature we liked most about it was the large outdoor swimming pool, which was open for guest use without additional charge. To Walt Disney's Magic Kingdom, the climax of our family dream journey. This is Disneyland as it was just 1 year after its official opening. We paused to have our pictures taken in front of the flowered face of Mickey Mouse outside the railroad station, and then we walked through the tunneled gateway to a world apart. The first thing we decided to do was to ride the Skyway to give ourselves a bird's-eye overview of the whole park. Sitting in a metal cable car moving along from tower to tower, we could see the rocket to the moon spaceship in Tomorrowland, the kid cars driving around Autopia, and the Disneyland train that encircled the park. The excitement kept mounting as the cable cars continued high in the air and passed over Fantasyland, where we looked down upon everything from the storybook whale to the tented carousel to the red and white sails of the pirate ship from Peter Pan. There were the Mad Hatter teacups, Dumbo the Flying Elephant, and Sleeping Beauty's towering castle, to say nothing of Frontierland and Adventureland. Having enjoyed this skyride preview, now let's go back to the entranceway and follow our dream through this magic kingdom step by step. To get into the park itself, you go through a short tunnel underneath the Disneyland and Santa Fe Railroad, and then the spell takes place. Children's faces looking up, holding wonder like a cup. This is the town square at the head of Main Street, USA, where all kinds of shops and friendly characters are found. Like this well-dressed sheriff, keeping everyone on good behavior. Even the street cleaners are in uniform, and they keep the place spotless. Our first stop was at the Disneyland City Hall to check in with our credentials as Scotch Tape Contest winners and to pick up 4 days' worth of free tickets for all the rides. When we emerged, all of us in our special Davy Crockett jackets, what did we find greeting us but the famous Disneyland Marching Brass Band, all in bright red uniforms. What a welcome! Then Mary noticed the Disneyland News on the corner stand, and sure enough, today's headline read, "The Barstow Family Visits Disneyland." That was enough to make anyone jump with excitement. We decided then that the children needed to have official Disneyland hats to replace their Connecticut sailor hats, at least for now. Dan and Dave bought space helmets, and Mary got a wide-brimmed plastic shade hat. Our first ride was on the horse-drawn trolley car down Main Street, USA, reconstructed as it might have been half a century earlier. This was remember when time for grown-ups, and why aren't things like this today? Time for the kids. On the right we saw the Main Street Cinema, starring Rudolph Valentino and Vilma Banky in Valentino's last film, The Son of the Sheik. Across the street were the Carnation Ice Cream Parlor, the Bake Shop, the Penny Arcade, and the Candy Palace, with all kinds of goodies in every window and storefront. At the end of Main Street, there's a circular park from which branch out the 4 different major theme lands. This is where we said goodbye to the straw-hatted horse that had pulled our trolley. Over on the right, we found first of all Tomorrowland, with a special clock telling what time it was all around the globe. We took a thrilling simulated ride in the rocket ship to the moon and back. And remember, this was 13 years before humans actually did set foot on the moon. Also in Tomorrowland were miniature spaceships revolving at various heights. And then the drive-it-yourself Autopia. Now, to pilot one of these little cars around the course, you had to be as tall as the bottom of this sign. David made it just by a hair, but poor Daniel wasn't high enough, so he had to find another activity, while David went for a drive. This was grown-up fun for an 8-year-old. The next land we visited was Fantasyland, the entrance to which is through the many-turreted Sleeping Beauty Castle, across a bridge over a protective moat. This fantastic kingdom has settings and rides from any number of different times and places and stories. Most of the attractions relate to a familiar Walt Disney movie or cartoon character. Danny's favorite was Dumbo, the flying elephant. He and his mother got into the seat behind the broad wing-like ears of the little elephant, and soon they were off and flying. The world goes round and round when you're up in the sky with an elephant. Here's how it looked to Danny and Meg as they sailed through the air on Dumbo's big ears. Hold tight. Another way to go round and round is in one of the Mad Hatter's teacups from Alice in Wonderland. By turning the wheel, you make the cup whirl. and all you can see is a dizzying blur. When you finally do stop spinning around,
we are back. Last time that we did a presentation together, Tammy, it was about the World's Fair, or World's Fairs in general. Is that right? You're still muted, by the way.
Yeah, it's not my first day on Zoom, I promise. Yes, it was. It was about World's Fairs.
So, what do you think about Disneyland as a permanent type of World's Fair?
That's a good question. I don't know where to start. First of all, I love this film, right? The family hamming it up at the beginning, and the whole narration, right? We can come back to that, but yeah, Disney was built on based on World's Fairs and Expos, right? Which is a legacy of imperialism. Countries would host fairs and expos at which they would demonstrate technological wonders, right? That spoke to their modernity and progress. And at the same time, they brought in groups of people, usually from the places they were dominating politically and economically, and setting them up in a traditional village, for people to look at. And so these fairs were about, making visitors feel good about their own country and their own imperial project, right? And so Disney has many similarities with this, with the Tomorrowland, right? Is a show of technology. They have Adventureland, where you can go to different environments, right? That you wouldn't necessarily be able to travel to in your life. And even the American small town gets presented here, right, at the 2/3 or 3/4 scale. But it's a town that is an idea of what America is like that didn't really exist. It's a town where you have access to all of the consumer pleasures with none of the responsibilities of citizenship, right? You don't have to deal with anybody that you don't want to deal with. You don't have to clean up after yourself, right? Because somebody will come in and sweep it up. So in many ways, it's as much of a fantasy as any of the Tomorrowland or Frontierland parts of Disney.
And the thing is that this is not the first amusement park. There were amusement parks, probably 50 years or even earlier before that. And it's interesting in reading about some of what Disney was talking about is he looked to things like Coney Island. He looked at amusement parks, and he did not want certain aspects of those to be in his park. For example, he did not want to sell beer. He said that that's not what my park's about.
Yeah, so places like Coney Island, Blackpool in England, Atlantic City, these were places that were oftentimes at the beach, and industrial workers whose time was very managed, right? They could you could get off work and head up for a week's vacation, companies, especially in England, would instruct their employees on how to take a vacation to one of these places, because they wouldn't come back on time, because they would go and they would drink and they would injure themselves doing something wild. Coney Island could be a pretty wild place. In New Jersey, there were all sorts of amusements and debauchery and body humor that would happen at those places. And Disney didn't find that model was good for American families, the American nuclear family, highly heteronormative, highly political charged in a Cold War environment, right, was supposed to have a place that was, supposed to uplift their morals. It was supposed to be good, clean fun. And the only way he could do that was by containing it. Right, so Disney in Anaheim, in Florida, right, it's very contained, right, to have that barrier between the real world and the world that Disney wants us to experience, and the way and the fantasy that people want to experience when they go there. It's supposed to be a world apart. Right?
So back to the narration of this film, and what resonated with you about that, about Robbins Barstow and his family going to Disneyland?
So this was the voice was recorded in 2002. Is that correct?
Right. And it's loosely based on what the script that he had written and had delivered when he started showing the film, and it changed over a period of time. But I guarantee you, the gags are exactly the same.
Yeah, and this is what makes it so endearing, right? Is that it's in the style of a young boy's voice, and it's a much older man reading it, right? And so you can see that this was an activity that he loved to do, right? That he loved to make films and be a part of them, and then gather people around them. Right, this is one of the cliches of the 1950s, right? The come over and see my vacation slides, and it became a cliche of 1950s suburban culture. But you can tell this was a medium that he loved, right? And so he's reading through this script, but there's some memory going on, and you can tell that he's still in love with that activity. And the family is really adorable, right? You can see why Scotch Brand chose this family, right? Because they're in their sort of Davy Crockett jackets, and they have fun together, and they're going to represent the Scotch Brand really well.
Nice, yeah. And I had to cut it off, but there's a whole thing about how they pack their lunches. And there's a whole gag thing about, like, there's this tiny bag and they just keep pulling food out of it. But basically they pack their lunches. That's, they were on a budget. There was 5 of them, and, they were trying to make a week out of visiting California. And I also had cut some of that out too, of them traveling to other parts of California, of Los Angeles and Southern California. But this is a family that was on a budget. And he kind of delights in showing us that they were, how resourceful they were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the book that you just published. Is it now available? The Mass Production of Memory.
It is not. It will be available in November. But I started that book actually because I was looking at 1950s vacation films. And I wanted to understand those in the context of the Cold War, race relations, the American family in a sort of geopolitical context, because people were leaving their homes, going to someplace different. And what I realized was that I needed to understand an earlier period before I could understand this mid-century period. And so I went back to the first mass-produced portable film camera, which was the Kodak. And so it was the Eastman Dry Plate Company that offered that starting in 1888. And so I wanted to see how they were conceiving of that technology when photography became more accessible, right? So people had photographs before, but it was a cumbersome endeavor, right? To bring a big camera and the glass plates and all of the developing materials. You'd have the know-how. And Eastman made a camera that would allow people to use it It put the images on film, and then they could send a film back to the Eastman Company and that would be developed. And so then they came out with a brownie around 1901, 1903, I think, and that made portable mass photography even more affordable for more people. And so I compared the ways in which people understood the activity and associated picture taking with mobility. So I looked at marketing from the Eastman Company, and they had a huge marketing budget. They had a sophisticated marketing campaign. On the line with like cosmetics and tobacco, they spent that much, right? And then I looked at the pictures that people took, and I wanted to see, did they follow the script that Eastman had? Did they do something different? I tried to read their any other materials that came with their trip to see what kind of experiences they had taking pictures. And I started to really understand how the inequities of travel in terms of sexual identity, race, ethnicity, economic class, affected the archive that we have now of travel. So if you had more freedom on the road, if you had more money, right, your photos were going to look very different. Right, so the people who were wealthier travelers tended to follow the script a little more, and the people who were less wealthy tended to focus more closely on their family members, their community, their own individual experiences, rather than trying to frame them, in the terms of their responsibility as people with cultural capital. Right, So that was a study of an earlier period, and I think your work, Skip, is inspiring me to take up that initial project that I wanted to take up and look at the moving image era.
Nice, yeah. That's So here's one final question, and then Jason will magically appear. It's actually two questions, but it's kind of related. All right. So when we get through this pandemic, do you and your family have a road trip planned somewhere?
Oh my gosh, I don't know where I'm going to go first.
You have no idea where you would want to go?
Oh boy, I have wanderlust, and so and I'm finishing a book about travel during this pandemic. So the train that goes by my house. Right, it's still running and it's still calling me, and I wish I could tell you where I'm going to go first, but I can't decide. Right, I think I'm going to have to do some meditating,
right,
to sort through all of the thoughts and all of the places that I've dreamed about. But right now, we as people who are living in a state that is a hot spot, right? We can't just go anywhere. I think the EU is thinking about making us quarantine. We have 3 states now that are asking North Carolinians to quarantine themselves. And so right now, films like this and travel shows and shows about geography and natural wonders, right? Those are helping me, and I think other people right now. I think when the pandemic first began, there was a trend on social media of sharing your old travel photos, right? And so I think there'll be a lot of pent-up demand for travel.
So one last question, and it just popped in my head. Selfies. Travel selfies.
Right. Right. So in the conclusion of my book, I talk about museums' concern with selfies, right? And obviously, there are ways to do a selfie that is not respectful of the place that you're in, right? And disrespectful photographic behavior goes back to 1888, right? So people not knowing where they're at, not knowing that they're guests, right? It predates the selfie.
Interesting.
Right? So there's a lot of pearl clutching about the selfie, right? And there are a lot of places to not take a selfie. But at the same time, who am I to tell anybody what their mnemonic device should be, right? It shouldn't be up to me, right? As long as they're being respectful, as long as they understand how that behavior affects the environment that they're in, right? I just don't see what most of the pearl clutching is about. So take selfies, everybody. Enjoy and put them in an archive so that future historians can have a ball with them.
Well, that's what I wondered, is the fact that people place themselves in these images, and what's more important is themselves being in the place and not the place itself. So, and then to see like Apple introducing features to black out your background is suddenly like, oh, well, it's just about taking pictures of you and not about you at the Smithsonian. It's now a picture of you. But
that's an impulse I understand, right? So going back to the grand tour of the 18th century, when Pompeo Bottoni was painting these young men who were traveling about, and they were usually from the newly rich class, right, who were supposed to go out and have their continental experience, they were pictured in the environment, right, in some sort of classical environment, so they could take that portrait back and show that they had been there, and then they had some duty, according to the culture, to instruct people about what they had seen. So they were supposed to magnify that experience, and that gave them some cultural cash, and so to have a photograph of a person in place, right, even if it's a place that every tourist, getting off a plane or a boat has taken, right, it shows that you were there, right? So that gives you that cultural capital. Right, so I think that impulse goes way back before the selfie. There are so many pictures of people in place taken by a brownie, right? I think I have some on the shelf behind me that I can pull out and show you. So it's an impulse that goes back, back to I guess the graffiti in ancient sites and pilgrimage sites, that says I was here.
Interesting. So we're not. So we've gone through this before. It's not Apple's fault. Or the selfie's fault. It's who we are as a people, and we've been that way for at least 150 years. That sounds like.
Absolutely.
Jason, you want to pop in?
I would, and I'd like to say a big thank you to Dr. Gordon for joining us again tonight to close out our extended series that lasted longer than it typically does, for better, despite the worst that's out there. So thank you, Dr. Gordon. We're very glad that you decided to join us again.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
And then a real heartfelt thanks to Skip, who does this nearly every day and then still decides to come and partner with NC State libraries every couple of weeks these days.
You guys are the best. I love it.
Yeah. Well, we're so happy to have you. Visit avgeeks.com for more info about what AV Geeks is. Check out and see what's online. Email them. Skip will read it probably. Check out compilations when the library is back open. Also visit archive.org and youtube.com. Some great websites there, and type in AV Geeks and see what you find. Watch other people's home movies, and just enjoy the indoors and pretend you're out of doors in the past through AV Geeks, archive.org, and others. We'll be back in the fall. I missed the meeting because a slushy machine broke, and that's the real reason. I just wanted to put that note out there. I missed the meeting. But there were some great topics discussed, and we can't wait to come back in August when school starts in whatever way it starts. So thanks, everybody. Thank you, Skip, for doing this.
Thank you, guys. Everybody have a good summer. If you like what I do, I'll be doing it Monday, 1 o'clock, same bat time, same bat channel. Take care, everybody. Have a good weekend.